Yeah, we're live. 11:30. So doing an early one. We'll do a late one as well. But I got excited because I wanted to talk about. If you take a look at the thumbnail that I have up, the thumbnail is a one of the four-hole throttle bodies, basically an EFI set. Fairly common for guys. If you haven't seen these before, if you take a look at, and these come in two different forms, really. So if you take a look at a guy that has a typical kind of carbureted small block, this particular one's a big block, or it could be a small block Ford, Chevy, Dodge, whatever. But if you've got a carbureted combination, and this is the typical route for guys to do this, could be done another way, is that they have an older car that was originally carbureted. They're thinking about upgrading to fuel injection. And this would be one of the ways that they would do it, is you take and replace the intake manifold with an intake manifold that has provisions for port injectors, so injectors and a fuel rail and such. And then, it looks like a carbureted intake. In this case, on the big block, it is an Edelbrock, like a converted Victor Jr. single plane intake manifold. And then with the port injection, so you got one injector for each port, and then you have a four-hole throttle body on top that just, provides the airflow, and then the fuel provides the fuel flow. Then you have a computer that determines how much fuel you're supplying under which conditions. And then usually, and you could do this two ways, the computer can also control the timing, or you could just have it be a typical vacuum and or mechanical advance for the distributor, just like you do with the carburetor. The other way to do this is to have the throttle body assemblies that have the injectors internally in them, and then they inject the fuel, and it's not port injected, it's throttle body injected. So there's a couple of different ways to do it, but I want to talk about this because it's fairly common for guys to, we as performance enthusiasts always want the thing that we don't have. If we're running fuel injection, I'm going to put a carburetor. I can remember wanting to go that direction when I had my 5-liter Mustang. And I saw that way back then, the guys from what's now Ford Racing, it was Ford Power Parts, I think, back then, their aftermarket division of Ford, they had intake manifolds available, or carbureted intake manifolds. And I remember with the guys that worked there at that Ford Racing or Ford Power Parts or Ford Performance Parts, whatever it was called before that, telling me, oh yeah, if you put this intake manifold on, it'll make a lot more power. Wasn't doing any testing back then, knew nothing about that. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that sounds good. And I bought the manifold, never put it on. And in fact, ended up just selling it later on for much less than I paid for it. But the intake manifold obviously is a big thing. And this is one of the things that we need to talk about. So we're talking about, we got to separate this, because unfortunately, learning about this, you have to learn that it's not a generalized thing. Carburation versus fuel injection. One of them is better, one of them is good, one of them is bad. This one good and this one bad. It's not like that at all. You get a lot of that because we, being human beings, particularly out of the internet, red is good and blue is bad, or red is bad and blue is good, whatever. It's not that at all. It's people. And it's the same thing with this. Fuel injection is not good and carburation is bad, or vice versa. It's not the way. It's not that. That's not it. Obviously, people have been running carburetors for years. They've been making lots of power with carburation. The OEMs use carburation for years and are using fuel injection as we get more stringent about people wanting fuel mileage and emissions and all of these things. So there's lots of good ways to do it. One of the things that I ran across, and the reason that I mentioned this situation with my 5-liter Mustang, is that we weren't just comparing carburation versus fuel injection. The old school guys are like, oh yeah, carburetor makes more power. Well, and what they didn't realize is that in their ignorance, they were actually correct. And the reason for that is, if we were comparing that particular intake manifold and a carburetor and its attending carburetor to my fuel injection, specifically my 5-liter Ford, my 5-liter Ford had a very, very long runner intake manifold. And so where that combination wants to make power is different than the carbureted style, that single plane carbureted intake manifold. They would want to make power at a different spot. So if you looked at them just strictly from a peak power standpoint, the single plane would probably make more peak power. Now, it would lose power through, unfortunately, with a otherwise stock motor, it lose power through most of the curve compared to that Victor Jr. style intake manifold. It was a Ford Racing deal, but compared to that single plane manifold. So it had nothing to do with carburation versus fuel injection or the thing that was supplying the fuel, and had everything to do with the intake manifold. So we see a similar situation with, if you take a look at the photo, the thumbnail that I have up, it's a big block Chevy, and we have port injection, and then we have the 4-hole throttle body. There are other things to consider too. So the first thing to consider when you're talking about this is, what kind of intake manifold are we actually talking about? If we're talking about carburation versus fuel injection, are you really just talking about an intake manifold comparison? So if we run a single plane intake manifold versus a dual plane, or a single plane versus a long runner factory EFI style manifold. So if we're looking at the big block, are we looking at some sort of converted single plane intake manifold, and then comparing that to like a long runner Gen 6 454 kind of EFI intake manifold? Are we comparing it to a throttle body injected intake manifold for the Gen 5 stuff, which would be much more like, a carbureted deal? It's just, it has a throttle body where it's injecting the fuel into, something that looks very similar to a kind of carbureted intake manifold. But even that's the case, are we looking at just, okay, it's not the throttle body that's injecting the fuel versus a carburetor, but also the intake style? That throttle body intake manifold probably is not going to be as good, doesn't flow as much, doesn't have a big enough opening. There are lots of things to look at there that's not just EFI versus carburation. Here's what I can tell you. If we look at EFI versus carburation, we see that both of them can be tuned to provide the right amount of air fuel. So if we're looking at that, both of them can do that. You might argue that an EFI has more tunability through a wider range of throttle inputs, different loads and RPMs and all that stuff. And that's definitely true. I have not seen somebody other than the OEMs, for their specific combination, be able to work a carburetor so that it made the perfect air fuel, desired air fuel, at every given combination of RPM and load. That's very, very difficult to do. With EFI, you can do that. You can make it do that. Because you're not, in a sense, a carburetor. It's it's requesting a given amount of fuel. The engine is requesting the fuel. With fuel injection, you're telling it how much fuel the engine is getting, and you're in much more control. So from that standpoint, you can decide, and that's why people choose it for things like, better emissions or reduced emissions output, better fuel mileage and all that. And that's why it's being used, because it is superior in that method. For wide open throttle, you could tune it and get the wide open throttle thing, especially at any specific RPM where you're making peak power. You can have both of them do that. And so that's not a problem. So getting that right is not an issue. I mean, take a look at, NASCAR and any of these things where they're using carburation, pro stock when they're using carburation, all of that you could make lots and lots of power with. So that's not an issue. In fact, you could argue, and this is one of the things that we want to talk about, is that if we're looking at any given intake manifold, like if we look at the thumbnail photo, we have a single plane intake manifold that's on a big block. We have a single plane with port injection and a 4-hole throttle body. If we put a carburetor on there, it's going to make more power. And now the carburetor guys are going, yeah, more power. The carburetor guys win. And the reason that it does that is because if we keep the intake manifold the same and we introduce fuel, going into the intake manifold, we get charge cooling, and it almost always makes more power from the charge cooling. You can also talk about atomization in the carburetor, because they've had a lot of development. They're really good at that, and the droplet size is good, and the charge cooling, a combination of that. Whenever I've done the testing, we use the same manifold. Remember, we're not changing manifold designs because that's a different thing. But if we're just deciding where the fuel gets entered and how it gets entered by electronic fuel injection of the carburetor, usually the carburetor makes more power. Now we could put our four-hole electronic carburetor or throttle body up there and get similar, if not the same, results that we do with a carburetor in terms of charge cooling. Although I'd like to see that, because I've seen a lot of instances where it actually doesn't do that maybe it doesn't atomize the fuel as well. One thing we can do is, like we talked about with the port fuel injection, we can get really good precise tuning even with the 4-hole throttle body. We just can't get it in individual cylinders. And that's another benefit that having port injection allows us to tune. If we have sequential fuel injection, we can tune each cylinder. And this is important, not so much because the carburetor doesn't know how to distribute fuel. It's actually pretty good at that. But the intake manifold doesn't know how to do that. If you have an intake manifold that has different length runners, different entry shapes. They're coming in at different angles, all sorts of things that make the intake manifold not be the same in every cylinder. So if you look at a lot of these composite fuel injected manifolds like LS motors and Hemis and modular Fords, Coyotes and stuff, one of the things that they do is it's pretty important for them to have all the cylinders getting the same runner length and taper and all that stuff, so that you get each cylinder making the same amount of power. You have an even power production. You give it the same amount of fuel and you give it the same amount of air, and has the same runner length, the same reflected wave, the same inertial ram, the same common plenum, all that stuff, then it does better. A carbureted intake manifold doesn't usually do that. A single plane, you get longs and short runners, and then a dual plane, they're all over the board in terms of length and efficiency. So you have all sorts of problems. So it doesn't matter that the carburetor can supply the right amount of fuel. Once it's supplied the right amount of fuel, getting it to go to all the individual cylinders evenly and effectively is a problem with the manifold design, not with the carburetor itself. And so that gets hard to do. With port injection, we can make the right amount of fuel go to each cylinder, and we can have any sort of air fuel number that we want there, even some sort of optimized one. That also doesn't cure having the right amount of fuel there, also doesn't cure other problems associated with the intake manifold design itself. Like we talked about, if we have a single plane manifold and it's a symmetrical port manifold, and we have the runners that are closest to the carburetor opening are shorter, and the outer runners that are farthest away on a V8 are typically longer. And so the manifold itself, those runners are going to want different air fuel curves at different RPMs, and they're also going to be producing different power outputs in each of those sets of cylinders at different engine speeds. So they're not going to be doing the same thing all the time like they would if all the runners were the same, like we were talking about with our EFI manifolds. It's one of the things that a lot of guys don't talk about, is that if we can design our intake manifold, because a lot of times the intake manifolds for an EFI, a modern EFI, are also designed for cost and also packaging. So if we can't package something so that it fits under the hood with the other things that are around it, distributors or whatever, if we can't package that and make them all the same, and then make them all grab from the common plenum the same way and get an equal amount of airflow, the OEMs are actually really good at that. And if you can make them all be the same, that's good. If you can't because of the other constraints, then that becomes a little bit more of a problem, but usually not nearly as much of a problem as it is with other earlier carbureted style manifolds. So, it becomes more difficult. But one of the things that guys look at is, and particularly guys that grew up with carburetors, is that they look at a carbureted induction system and they go, oh, I want to put fuel injection on. I want to make a lot more power. You're probably not. And that's part of the problem. In fact, you could be going backwards in terms of power output. And then also, if you have a really good carbureted combination, if you spent a lot of time, maybe you've taken it to dyno, maybe you're good at carb tuning, maybe you've made that combination work really well, and then you go to put fuel injection on it and you think, oh, this is going to be superior in every way. One, it's probably not good if it's a port injected one. And even if it's a throttle body injected one, it might not make more power than the carburetor that you have. If it is better than the carburetor, maybe it's because you're tuning it, and under cruise, you can do some of that stuff. But I've seen instances where that's even problematic. What usually doesn't happen, other than, like I said, the potentially the fuel mileage and the ability to do micro tuning on it, carbureted combinations work pretty well. They specifically work really well for power. So if a guy's thinking he's putting the kind of combination on that I showed you in the thumbnail, and that, I'm going to get a lot more power from that combination compared to my carburetor, really the only way I can see that happening is if you had too small of a carburetor on there and you were restricting the airflow, and now you've put this other setup where there's more airflow now. But that honestly would be very, very rare, and probably not the kind of guy that's going to switch over to something like this. It's probably not in that situation. The other potential situation I could see where a guy doesn't want to do a blow through carburetor, although Kevin, I'm sure, is going to tell me that I'm wrong. You would have way more control with electronic fuel injection. So if you put a bonnet over it, let's say that you were going to use the single plane intake manifold with a 4-hole throttle body and port injectors, and some sort of bonnet over that. You've got a turbo or a blower going through an air to air or air to water intercooler and then blowing into this thing. You would probably have a better combination of drivability and power, and maybe not power, but because you'd have the charge cooling with the carburetor. But you'd certainly have better tunability with that on a boosted application. And let's face it, if you can get a boosted combination tuned correctly, because I think a lot of them suffer from problems from them not being tuned correctly and not having ring gap, that they hurt them because of that. And so if you can solve that, if you got a little bit more power from the charge cooling offered by a blow through carburetor, that would kind of just be icing on the cake. I'd say the big step is getting it tuned correctly. And I'd say more people would benefit from that, from the EFI stuff. So, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and you guys can chime in there and tell me what you think. Okay, would you pick a carb combo over an EFI combo for street use? So are you going carb or are you going EFI? The other thing we didn't talk about is cost, but a standalone management system, you could get if you're doing an LS, you could get the Rebel deal from the guys at Haltech. The Holley stuff that I use a lot, you could get an MS3 Pro or Micro Squirt or Mega Squirt or those kinds of things. But even carburetors are not inexpensive anymore. There are some of the brawler stuff from Holley, which is still kind of affordable. You could still go the wrecking yard route, particularly if you know how to rebuild a carburetor. I've found Holley's, performance-esque Holleys in the wrecking yard still. I do still see Quadrajets there, so those are still available. Carburetors for max power, normally aspirated EFI port injection for a balance of fuel efficiency, cruising, and steady, respectable power. That's a good combination. I had a big resonator and 4-inch side pipe to my van. 300 inline 6 rasp is no more. As the rusted out muffler is no more. You can change it a lot from the right kind of exhaust setup. That's cool. I've heard fuel injection often over atomizes fuel, blocking necessary oxygen need for peak combustion. Are you talking about the fuel is displacing some of the air? Oh, what is, somebody explain their 8 and BNR? Somebody explain over atomizing. I honestly don't think you could get droplet size to be too small. The more droplet size, the smaller the droplet size is, the more surface area you have, the better that the power production is going to be. Because the droplet size is going to determine how easy this thing is to actually atomize. And so I don't know that you can over atomize that. What happens normally is you don't atomize enough of the fuel. You don't turn the fuel into vapor. And so I don't know if over atomizing is the thing. I'm putting a 6-liter in place of the 454 in my truck. What do you think would be smoothest for pulling capacity? I don't know what you mean by smoothest. Are you asking for a cam recommendation, or are you asking for a difference between those two? A 454 is going to make more low speed torque than a 6-liter is if they're both stock. So maybe tell me what your exact question is. What about price? For example, if you put a carburetor setup on a Hemi or LS, it will cost a lot of money. You could put in making more power and torque with the EFI setup. Yeah, it depends on what you're starting with. If you already have an EFI, LS, or Hemi, going to a carburetor is going to be another expense. If you go get a motor from the wrecking yard, that even if it has like an LS or Hemi and it has the injectors and the stock injectors and the rails, you still don't have any fuel injection unless you also get the harness and factory computer. Or you don't get that stuff and you don't buy, because at the wrecking yards that I go to, you actually have to pay now for the intake manifold and the injectors and that stuff. So if you take that off and essentially buy a long block, then you could get something like the MSD ignition conversion and a carbureted intake manifold and a carburetor. Point of the carb cheater is to keep AFR where you want it. Not sure if any of the late 70s or early 80s electronic carb setups did that. They did. They ran feedback carburetors with O2 sensors on them, and they were pretty good at cruise RPM. They and situation load. They were pretty good at keeping air fuel consistent. Richard, have you ever run a turbo or supercharger with a Holley Sniper throttle body? I don't think I've done a blow through. I did one with a fast, but not on a Holley, although I would assume it would be very similar. I spent as much on tuning as an MSD box and performer RPM, and the tuner disappointed me. I can make a carb engine run like it should on my own. That's good, and that is something to consider. Is that with EFI, you're going to have to, if you can't tune it yourself, which is why I learned how to do it. But if you can't tune it yourself, you're going to have to spend money to have it done. And there's lots of guys out there that aren't as good as they will tell you they are, or as you need them to be to get your combination running correctly. Scott, what's going on? The only issue with carbs is getting enough runner length and fitting it under the hood. Don DCI hates the Holley Sniper and other throttle body EFI bolt-on kits used on a Pontiac V8. States terrible fuel distribution, impossible to tune correctly. Likes port EFI like Elbrock ProFlow. I know early on, Brule and Eric and the guys at Westech and Ish had there were issues with the 4-hole throttle body stuff, getting it to be repeatable. And I don't know about the blow through part of it, because they didn't test a lot of that. But there were issues with those, and which is why for the longest time I was not recommending them. I just seen too many problems where you run one and it does what you want it to do, and you don't make any changes, and then you run it again and it doesn't do it again. And the thing is, you have to have a system that's repeatable and reliable to do the same thing over and over again. If you make a change, then I could say, okay, there should be a change. But if you don't make a change, it should just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And there were issues with that. I don't know if they've got that cured now. Being more atomized doesn't displace oxygen. If you have the same amount of fuel and you just atomize it differently. 4150, 4500, and Quadrajet Don loves. So he's a carburetor guy. I get it. He likes carburetors. It's a perfect area to test. What are we testing? 4150s and 4500s and Quadrajets? We're testing that versus what? Doesn't seem like a sniper could be worse than a carburetor. I myself am a big believer in carburetors. Not because I'm an older carbureted guy. In fact, I learned way more about fuel injection long before I learned about carburetors. But having run hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them on the dyno, every time we put one on, it works. And if it doesn't work, it's usually something that we did. There's a clog in something, or a gasket we didn't put in correctly, or something like that. If you put them on there, they work. In fact, most of the time they work very, very well. I've not put a carburetor on there, like an out of the box carburetor or even out of the cabinet carburetor, and put it on there and had it not work because carburetors don't work. I've never run across that. Smaller droplets are more better. Yep, I think everybody would argue that that's correct. Direct injection is a perfect example of getting smaller droplets. Yep. You're going to add an air-fuel ratio gauge to an old-school carb vehicle. Would a wideband or narrowband be best? A wideband would be better, because more than likely what you're going to have is given that it's like we talked about, not the carburetor issue so much, although it could be if there's a problem with it. the intake manifold, you're probably gonna have a wide range of air fuels. So you need to be able to read all of them. I mean, a wideband is going to be good. You don't really want it to be 8-to-1. You also don't want it to be 16 or 17-to-1. It's going to be hopefully in a good range, but it could still be. I mean, I've seen them go in the nines, but it could be 10 or 11-to-1, and it could be 14 and a half or 15-to-1, even when it's working right. It's my issue. I have a long block Hemi and no intake, so trying to decide the route to go. I think I still have the dual quad Hemi intake manifold, Aaron, although you'd have to get carburetors for it. Although I have to say, I have used narrow band sensors. They're supposedly narrow band sensors, and use them with great success, even back in the olden days with the little BZ LED meters, and it was surprisingly accurate. It was way. It's not going to tell you that it's 11.6 or 11.7, but quite honestly, I don't care whether it's 11.6 or 11.7. I care whether it's 11 or 9. Or 11 or 15. And so this would tell me when we're cruising in the range of, it's 14.7, when it's cruising along and it's under closed loop and it's doing what it's supposed to do. If you're cruising along under closed loop and it should be at 14.7, and instead it's 9-to-1 or it's 18-to-1, then you have a problem. You don't care whether it's 14.7 or 14.8 because it's going to cycle back and forth through that anyways. It's going to be bouncing around because it's going to be doing, even if everything's perfect and you have the amount of trim down to 1 or 2%, it's still going to cycle. I mean, it does that because you're going to be changing your throttle position unless you're on just a dead, perfectly flat road and you can be exactly perfect on the throttle. It's going to move around a little bit, and they do that, and that's okay. So even on those narrow bands with that little meter on it, it worked great. When we went to wide open throttle on the supercharged Mustang and it went rich because we had a Hariba on it, it showed way rich. It showed rich on the meter, and it was consistent. It would go down to the same color LED when it would go down to 11-to-1 or whatever we were looking at on the Hariba. So actually it worked pretty good. So I think that those are fantastic. And I would love having that like that. I don't compare that to having a dead accurate airfield digital readout. I compare that to not having anything. Hey, what are you doing? You don't just come and sass like that. I'm working. Come here. Get over here. You don't come sass. I don't care if you have to go out. Go see. Who's here? Go see. There's nobody here, Dad. There's nobody here. I would hear them. I'm a dog. I have better hearing than you. I do. Hello. Okay, go lay down. What? More pets? Okay, I know. Well, go lay down. You're going to be on guard duty. You're supposed to be guarding me. What if somebody tried to attack me? There, Lord of Camelot. I saw, Scott, that the guys from Brian Julie Racing are using the Camelot designation too. And I told Brian about that a long time ago because that was the name of my area that I had at West Tech. It's been more than a decade, I'm sure now. Longer than that now, I think. Man, it has been a long time. The table that I had back there with all the cams stacked on it. That was the nickname I gave it. Scott, you get 22 thumbs up. I like that. That would really add to the total a lot. A narrowband sensor would probably just tell you you're off the scale, Rich, all the time. They work surprisingly well. Like I said, I think a wideband O2 would be great. Tuning aid and carb applications, it would. Any kind of O2 sensor, any kind of reading that you get from anything would help tell you a direction. But you have to understand what the airfield meter or what the airfield should be under the conditions that you're adjusting the carb with. What carburetor did you pick for your 292 that you got from Freiberger? Remember that you're still add a turbo to this and want to use the same carburetor. I don't think that I would use the same carburetor NA as I would use boosted. I don't feel comfortable enough doing that. I don't think that the same carburetor would work well for both of those applications unless I did it as a draw through. If I did it as a draw through, probably a 500 CFM 2 barrel would work fine for that. Or I think I still would have a hard time going to a two barrel on something like that with that stock intake manifold blowing into that single hole. It would not be too big of a deal. But I think I would use a four barrel. I like the a small four barrel. I like the idea of using a small four barrel, particularly if we can get small primaries. Because then when you're cruising, you want to cruise, right? You want to get good mileage. And then when you go to wide open throttle, you want to dump all the fuel in and make all the boost and make all the power. Can you test the difference between adding a ton of plenum volume, 1 foot long spacer versus a big cone shape on the top side of the carburetor? We did spacers before, and so spacers are typically, if you're talking about adding space before or after the carburetor is going to be different than after the carburetor. After the carburetor is going to affect the signal, but before the carburetor is also going to affect the signal, but because of a different way. If we put a radius entry or an air hat, which is what you're talking about, when we put an air hat on the carburetor, it definitely changes the power output of the motor, but it changes the signal to the carburetor because it also changes the air fuel curve. So we know that having an air meter on there definitely changes the way that the carburetor produces power. I've had success with both and I've had troubles with both. Nothing that I couldn't fix myself, but rebuilding carb seems a lot easier than replacing. Let's see how I got lost. They're replacing all the injectors and an entire ECU. One of the things that I don't like is when I get injector leaks. I don't like the O-ring leaks. Carbs can work great. I've been using them forever. Went to EFI when I went to the F2 Pro Charger for timing and fuel control. Not have that with a carburetor and a distributor. Timing is the thing that I would be much more concerned with on like a blow through application, because having the timing right, you're going to ruin it with timing way before you ruin it with air fuel. I never used to how bad talk to Texas. I don't really understand your statement. Are you saying bad things about people in Texas? Because you shouldn't do that. Or are you talking about they have a southern draw or something? Dual quad would be neat on this. I was thinking of getting a 6.1 intake since I've ported 6.1 heads. And people don't understand with port fuel injection, you're not trying to atomize the fuel. What you're trying to do is hit the back of the valve and vaporize it. You think that the intake valve is going to be hot enough to vaporize the fuel? Test it all. We listen to your assessments. What is it you wanted me to test, though? Is this still the carburetor thing? Scott, you going to try again? Okay, give me another shot at it. The newer Holley single 4150 EFI intake has my interests since I can run carb or EFI. Whenever I order an intake manifold, like if I want to test something and they have an intake manifold set up for port injection, like a carbureted style intake manifold, I always get that one because then I can do just what you're talking about. I can run it either carbureted or fuel injection. Sometimes, which I ran into this with the small block Chevy intake manifold when I was doing the 302 versus the 305, the 5-liter shootout that I did, we ran into an issue where the carb linkage wanted to hit the fuel rail because we just stuck the injectors in there to plug them. And I could have just put plugs in there and done it too, but we ended up just putting a spacer under the carburetor and moving up to make it work. But I like having those intake manifolds, whatever engine family it is, because then I can run it carbureted. We just plug the holes, or I can run it port fuel injected and it works good. And I can also run it with a 4-hole throttle body if we wanted to do that. Ford Motorsport, that's who it was. Bart at Pro Speed has all the Hemi parts you need. I'm going to go on the floor. No, he doesn't have to go to the bathroom. He knows how to come get me for that. Just in this live chat, which is my first one, I have to say you answered like 6 different questions in my head. There's a lot of good people here. There's a lot of good questions, a lot of good answers. Richard, have you heard of Osmo intakes? What are they? Are they from Australia? I've talked to a few carburetor builders for E85. All refuse to build with annular boosters, say that it's all wrong. But BLP Bola says they can do annular boosters E85 and have it work for me. I don't know. Now that you mentioned that, I don't remember looking at the. Let me look at the. I'll go back and look at the carburetors that we've run. We run the CSU one most often, but we also have run quick fuel stuff as blow through ones. But I don't remember what boosters they had. If you can get a good read on things with a regular narrowband sensor, then I'll be out hooking up my multimeter to the sensor leads and referring to the chart. You can do it that way too. If you know what the chart is relative to voltage, that works. Any sort of comparative data that you can get is good. Anytime you can correlate that. This chat is worth the price of admission, Scott. Did we all pay to get here? Everybody's getting their money's worth. I have a 438 big block Chevy engine, D-stroke Pro Stock. Wow. Tunnel Ram 21050s. Would I lose a lot of power putting 2 850 Tunnel Ram carburetors on it? I would say yes. I don't know what do you know what the motor is making and what kind of RPM you're running? If it's a Pro Stock motor, those could be a lot if it's the original 500-inch one. One of the things I've seen with tunnel rams that were designed for Dominator style carburetors is that when we put 4150 carburetors on, even if it's a 1050 Dominator and a pair of 1,000 CFM 4150s, it tended to make better power with the Dominator, which I think had more to do with the spacing of the bores on the carburetor and getting them closer to the ports than it did with the flow rates of the carburetors. I don't think that we were limited in flow because we didn't see a big change in vacuum. I think that it had to do, and we saw this on the LS too, when I ran a single carbureted application, a single plane, but with an intake manifold designed for a 4150, or designed for a 4500, the 4500 intake made more power. We ran it first with a Dominator, and I'm like, well, I wonder if it's just the carburetor. And then we put a 4150 on it with an adapter, with a Wilson adapter on it. And it made more power than the 4150 intake manifold did with the same 4150 carburetor on it, but made less than it did with the 4500 carburetor on there, if that makes any sense. I sold my very first narrowband meter, originally had it on my Spirit, but went wideband 8 years ago. I think it's a different vaporization rate of gasoline versus the 85 versus methanol. I really like the factory port fuel injection on 424 Gen 6. Do you like that intake manifold, BNR? It does make good low-speed power, that's for sure. I'd like to make a spacer for that and, get that plenum volume. LS injectors have the cap that tuners remove specifically for atomizing the fuel. They remove the cap for better atomization? Are you talking about when they decap the injectors? Because that's cutting the disc off of it. And I don't think getting rid of the plastic cap on most of those injectors is a good idea if more atomization is their deal. Todd, you got your truck running again? Good. I hope it stays together. Carbs are cool, but there's only one spider injection. Does spider injection rule above all others? What intake would you recommend for a 600 with a Holley 600 carburetor? If you have a 600 CFM carburetor, my guess is it's a mild combination. I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here. Probably a dual plane. like an RPM or an RPM air gap. I read somewhere that if your carb is a little on the small side, one should run an open spacer and vice versa. If it's a little too big, run a 4-hole spacer. I don't, for me, that's not carburetor related. What spacers typically do, at least on a dual plane, because they might do nothing. A carburetor might do nothing on a single plane manifold. On a dual plane, putting a spacer on there, an open or a 4-hole space, even a 4-hole spacer, I would, well, first of all, spacers, you have to find out if they even work, if they even do anything on your combination. But what a spacer does, like what an open spacer does on a dual plane manifold, is it shifts power higher in the RPM range, and then it reduces power in the low RPM range. And I don't think that that's a function of flow. CSU has aerosol boosters. Is that what they're called? I've paid about 3 advertisement breaks so far. Nice. I think it wouldn't work when the airflow rate goes up and the signal is more constant. Current, go for everything. 500, 700 horsepower is a 52-pound truck flex fuel injector. Oh, that's what you go to right now? It's the 52-pound flex fuel injectors. Those will support a lot of power. Those will support 800 NA horsepower. Teach me more about carbs. I've never had one. We just take them out of the box and put them on, and then they work. I like the exhaust tone of the big cam and carb setup. My exhaust note sounds not good with the turbo. Okay, Green Bass. I misread your thing. Richard, I'm saying the cap is there to modify the spray pattern for more atomization. That's what I think, yeah. Tuners remove it because the flow rate goes up when you do that, as you know. Misinterpreted. But I don't think that removing the cap, the plastic cap, changes the flow rate of the injector. Does it do that? I'm going to test that. I'm going to take one of the injectors and take the cap and break the cap off, just the plastic cap, and see if it changes the flow rate of the injector. I want to see if that happens. I'm curious. The average cruise temp for an intake valve is 120 to 200 degrees C. Under wide open throttle, it can get 300 degrees C. Is that enough to flash vapor the fuel? According to the interwebs, pro stock motors are 1,400 and near 11,000. Yeah, that's real. About one month ago, I towed 2 hacks, GF 521 tunnel ram, 68 Thunderbird to the track, 110 miles each, Morocco, Indiana. Nice. The 454 ran good. They're good motors. Way back, I ran a narrowband gauge with propane carburetors. Where does a propane carburetor want to run? I don't know what stoic is on propane. Can't imagine towing a 95-degree heat carburetor unless a quadrojet was used. We had to put a fuel cooler on our big block on our 77 dually to stop the thing from vapor locking. Skullman, you got a job? That's fantastic. Refer to the sloppy wiki for what I'm talking about. Decapping the injectors has to do with grinding the cap off the end. I know what decapping injectors is. We did it long ago. In fact, the guys from Powertrain Dynamics did it way before sloppy was even before Matt even had done that. Before he had even started sloppy mechanics. This was back when I was doing Honda stuff, so it's probably 10 years before sloppy mechanics I get it. But he showed me how to do it. In fact, he did it for the injectors that we ended up using on the Bonneville. We ended up using them on the Bonneville Civic. He had some 36-pound Ford Bosch injectors, and that they ended up flowing, I don't know, 75 or 80 pounds, I think. But we did have to do 8 of them before we got 4 good ones. I need to trade my old decaps for something fancy like Bosch 210s. We ran those modified injectors a long time before we changed to anything else. Because back then I didn't know of anything that we could do other than really, really expensive ones. And I didn't have the money for stuff like that. Aftermarket EFI to aftermarket carb. I choose a carb. I've seen the EFI systems are finicky in Wyoming winters. That's interesting. Normally, that's also one of the reasons that fuel injection is, from an OEM standpoint, would be superior to carburation, is that the range of when you can use it, temperature ranges basically for startup is what they're looking at. They want, and because this is what the public wants from a factory setup, is we want to go in, get in the vehicle and have it start up immediately, regardless of whether it's minus 30 or 130. We want that to happen. And with fuel injection, obviously at an OEM level, you're much more likely to have that happen than with EFI than you are with a carburetor. I ran 15.4 cruise and 13 wide open throttle, dry fuel, so I didn't get too concerned about cooling. But you're going to participate in the upcoming Hot Rod Power Tour. I'm not going to. I don't normally do those things. I've only got to do test passes, but hope to next year bring something boosted on a small tire. Cool. Trying to find a middle ground price point between Deca 80s and the Bosch 210s. Not doing snake eaters. The snake eaters that I have some 1500s, and they've worked really good. I don't know what the slope is, but they've worked good for our wide open throttle stuff on the dyno. I want to see someone take a regular throttle body and mount injectors fore or aft of it and control them with a fuel tech or something DIY rigged for EFI. So you want the fuel injectors to be mounted in the manifold, or if you look at like what you're talking about is kind of what they did with back in the day. Guys did that with blowers. So they would just put all the injectors in a rail and then put them either below the blower, like a 671 or an 871, either below the blower or on top of the blower, and just feed them all in. And I remember one guy telling me, he goes, yeah, we can run it sequential. I'm like, what? The motor's not going to care about it being sequential. That's not going to do anything. I mean, it might help fuel mileage a little bit, only because you're not spraying the extra fuel. I said, but I guarantee you that where you're spraying it and when you're spraying it on top of the blower, it's just grabbing some fuel from below that. Missed your live yesterday, but they said they removed the math and temp sensor. Did they tune for missing sensor? I don't know what your question is. Who removed what math sensor and temp sensor for what? What are you talking about? I live in Alaska and I would literally want a carbureted vehicle in the winter up here. Always wanted to go EFI. I love the control and it gives, especially being boosted. Yep. A dirt cheap rigged Holley TBI setup. Wideband reading Lambda makes tuning a lot easier. It does. I don't when I'm doing carburetors, when we're doing, because Brule was famous for this. He would always want to go in, and I didn't care about it at all. He'd always, as soon as he started up put a new carburetor on there, he'd go in and go through his whole carburetor thing. He would go in and set the idle at some reasonable amount, depending on what camshaft was at, and then he'd start adjusting the idle mixture and get the idle mixture right, and go through all the tip in and all that stuff. I'm like, Steve, I don't care that it returns back to idle and idles at 800 RPM. I said, I don't care about that. All I care about is this part of it, because I know this is what we got to do. And God bless him. That's great. Carbs can also be finicky until they warm up, but self-learn systems aren't always so self-learn. My friend always had to mess with it on a computer. I was upset about the upfront cost of the Holley HP years ago before the yearly price increases. Wish I got the damn Dominator back then. Yeah, when they first came out, it was a pretty good deal, especially, before COVID and stuff. Can you get similar charge cooling effects from water meth injection on an EFI system? No, probably not. you can get charge cooling, and I have water mess stuff up there. You can get charge cooling from it. But the amount of, particularly if you're already injecting the fuel, the amount of water that you could add to that to get the charge cooling, like you're adding a lot more fuel than you're adding water methanol. So the charge cooling you get from the fuel, which is necessary, is going to be more than you would get from the water methanol injection. You can get charge cooling from that, and it does work. It doesn't normally add power, though. You wouldn't want a carb in the winter in Alaska. Yeah. I was going to mention something, but I didn't want to throw any carb shade or Alaska shade or anything, because Alaska seems like the place where you would want EFI. Rogue, I think I already answered your question, right? A dual plane RPM or RPM air gap for your carbureted 302. High carbs work better with the return fuel pressure regulator. Have you tested a few years back on? You've tested that? I took a TPI injected car and swapped a carb 383, and because the wiring scares me. Well, a carb 383 is definitely going to make more power than a stock TPI motor. The guy who installed the cam, well, he didn't install my cam. He installed the Truck Norris cam. And when he wasn't having good dyno results, we talked about what it was. He didn't get rid of a mass air meter. He didn't do any of that. All of that stayed stock. And he ended up having good results because he didn't have the what we talked about was that he added a hot air intake setup for it. And also he wasn't running any timing because he said he was getting into detonation. Because he had a hot air intake setup on it. Once the Holley fuel bowls get hot, boiling gas inside, it's all over. I purchased my Holley Dominator EFI and ID220 injectors in 2017, and it was $8,000 for that. Man, that seems like a lot. I thought that they were like $2,000. Does temperature and EFI matter? Would it have the same effect on a 95-degree day with equal thermostat of 180 degrees? I don't know what you're asking. Are you asking whether or not it will start properly? That's the nice thing about EFI is it has temp sensors in it. It has both water temp and air temp sensors, and it makes adjustments. Usually startup fuel is not a big thing. You don't need a big change in startup fuel. But the startup fuel and all that is all related to, in that case, it'd be water temperature. And that's why EFI cars, when they're properly set up, that's why if you go get in any modern new fuel injected car, direct injected, whatever, and because the OEMs test all this stuff, they go to Alaska or Denver or wherever they need to do cold weather testing, and they tested minus 30 degrees, and then they go test it in Death Valley at 120 or 130 degrees and make sure that the thing sits there and heats up and then starts right up. Holley Quick Fuel 650, mechanical secondary, annular boosters, 350 small block, 400 horsepower, Edelbrock air gap dual plane. Should I step up to a 750? Hey, you're not going to get a big gain from a 750 on a 400 horsepower setup. You might get 8 or maybe 10. If I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with minimal tools, I'd take the carburetor. I've heard people say that, and I understand the logic for that. And the other argument is that, oh yeah, when the EMP hits or whatever, when during the apocalypse or whatever, I want a carbureted one and a points distributor or whatever. In that unlikely scenario, sure, you would do that. But the argument about being stuck somewhere, the thing is, with a modern fuel injected car, how often do people break down in the middle of nowhere? There isn't a modern fuel injected car that I wouldn't go get in right now without even looking at what kind of car it was and go drive across the United States. An older carbureted car, I definitely would have concern about that. And an older fuel injected car, I would also have concern about that, which I do because I got to go pick up my Omni GLHS and drive it back possibly from Ohio. And I'm very concerned with that because it has 40-year-old electronics in it. Factory EFI in -30 is reliable. Aside from pumping the pedal on my carb, I've never had start issues. Do you have a pick for Eric's cam contest? Do I have a pick of what? You can't, if you're asking me to pick somebody that's going to do well in that contest, you can't pick that based on a person or their name or their reputation. You'd have to pick it based on whatever their cam specs are. And so whatever they chose, I would like to know what that is, and then I could pick from the cam specs. But I think what you'll see, and this is what we saw when I did Engine Masters, is that you're going to get a lot of guys, if there are a lot of guys even being involved in this, if there's lots of cam guys that are going to make very, very similar power, I think. When you're going to meet zombies with speech impediments. Do they have to, are they all very eloquent? I mean, in your zombie apocalypse, they're all rogue scholars. On a road trip, I trust a carburetor way more than EFI. I think that's backward thinking. When should you go with an aftermarket oil pump on an LS? If you upgrade it, do you go for a high pressure? I don't ever do that. I haven't ever. The only time I consider changing the oil pump is if I build a motor and have more bearing clearance, or if I were to put maybe multiple turbos on there where I'm feeding more oil to the turbos and then want maybe more oil flow. Otherwise, it's not, your stock pump can flow more oil than your combination can use. Has anyone built a 4R70 themselves or know a good shop in the Bay Area? Ryan would like to know. Zombies come out after November 5th. Yeah, but they'll be easy to spot. I use the high pressure, high volume pump because my turbo has a -6 feed line. Is it restricted though at the turbo at least? Would you pick a carb combo over an EFI combo for street use? 56% are saying no. We got 2 more minutes. Precision Turbo says not to restrict it. What size is the opening on that? It's not a -6 line into a into a -6 size opening feeding the turbo, right? That seems like it would be a lot of oil flow and potentially problematic. It's an 88mm Pro mod. Okay. Ball bearing double throwdown, wishbone, alley cat, hush puppy, shoe, and crumb cake. I think an in-tank electric fuel pump with a return stall regulator would greatly improve a carb, reduce vapor lock, vaporization, and bowl starvation in cold weather. So my question on that would be, we know the system from the pump to a carburetor is, let's say, 6 or 7 PSI. And so is the fuel getting hot from that pressure increase, or is the fuel getting hot from its presence inside the heated engine compartment, or from the heated carburetor itself? Is vapor lock less of a problem at wide open throttle since we'd have lots of fuel flow And then we would have, if you have ever felt a carburetor at wide open throttle, it's actually very, very cold. and even with a regulator, you're gonna have the regulator before the carburetor, right? And you're gonna be returning the fuel back to the, so you could cure a lot of the heated fuel in the engine compartment if you had the regulator up by the carburetor and then the return line went back to the tank. Then you'd only have the area from the regulator up to the carburetor, because you're not going to feed the carburetor and then have a return come out of the carburetor fuel bowl to a regulator. I've never seen that. I don't know if that's possible. Richard, you send tracking numbers with the cam orders? I got a different phone and don't think my emails are going through. I can, yeah, I can send you an email. I don't, it's not part of the system because I'm manually inputting all those, but I can give you a tracking number because it gives me that when I ship them. My skill level is novice. I put my motor together with mistakes and tears. Hopes and dying dreams. Best intake for a cathedral port is a fast. I think that's probably true, up to 7,000. Try to help a guy on Facebook, then OB1 EFI nightmare on Saturn. Doing swaps and harness swaps and that kind of stuff, you got to be on your game if you're doing stuff like that. And I'm not the guy for that. Is there any gain to tuning the distributor weights to kick in fully in the RPM range? Yeah, we recurve distributors when we run them on the dyno, not at 2,000 RPMs. We don't want all in by then, because then you may as well just run a locked distributor then. Normally 3,000 or so is when we're all in on a distributor. But to give you an idea, when we run an EFI combination, we don't ever have all the timing in at 3,500 RPM, but we do on a carbureted combination, which it shouldn't probably be like that. But when guys back in the day would recurve distributors, that's what they would do. You can change the weights, but we normally do it with a spring set and a bushing on the MSD distributors, and we can have it all come in. We just put light springs in it, and then we put we can change the amount and then how fast it comes in. Must be an EFI guy who wants the high-tech tracking number stuff. Yeah, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I just called or sent an email and requested a tracking number on something. So high pressure, high volume pumps are great for running extremely low RPM. I feel like idling at 350 RPM. Yeah, we don't normally do a high pressure and high volume stuff on LS motors. I've seen guys do that on some of the other stuff, Fords and Chevys and things like that. All right, Scott, we'll see you later. At what point would you fire ring a big block? I've never done that, so I'm the wrong guy to ask. If it goes beyond an MLS head gasket and ARP studs like hoops and all that stuff, I don't really get involved in that because I don't ever build those kinds of motors. The 5 or 10 people or whatever that are building those kinds of things for drag race stuff are not going to be coming to this channel to ask me about that. They're not going to be looking for information on that, and I'm the wrong guy to ask because I've never done it. So 1,100 horsepower big block doesn't require fire rings. We do that level all the time. I thought you were talking about 2,500, that kind of stuff. At least on the old Chevy trucks, fuel lines run on the inside of the chassis. That's where ours did on our big block. Fuel begins to heat there, and the mechanical pump is probably the hottest spot. So vaporizing into the fuel bowl. Yeah, we had that issue with ours. We even wrapped our fuel lines with we use it's closed cell foam, but we use pool noodles basically to insulate it to try to get some of the heat away from it. Fuel lines close to exhaust manifolds. Yeah, and if you look at an exhaust manifold in a big block lugging up a hill towing a trailer, it's glowing pretty hot. My secondary is open way too slow on my AVS. Just need more motor under it. Why does Holly keep selling the throttle body kits? I think that they got it. Ish was telling me that they got it pretty well worked out now. So I've not tried one since that, but he says that they work pretty well now. I want the high volume oil pump on my 427 because I've had an oil feed Novi 2200, and but I still fear what I've heard about high volume pumps tearing the distributor gear out and bearing washout. I don't think you have to worry about bearing washout. I don't think that that's an issue. The distributor gear, I think if you have if that's a hydraulic roller like a billet cam and a billet gear, I don't think that that's going to be an issue. When I would be worried about that is actually at startup when it's cold. My small Chevy is above that power level MLS gasket and 20 psi, and I've run 27 with an MLS. Yeah, all of the stuff that I've run, like I look at 1500 and lower, maybe only because that's as far as I've gone. 1540 with that one big block. That's an MLS head gasket, and that's a factory LS9 head gasket. I mean, we did surface it so that it was smooth, and we used those CA625 head bolts. We even use ported 317 heads, which were, in my opinion, a mistake on my part. But it worked, and it worked for lots of dyno pulls like that. I don't know that I'd be running that out of the track like that at that power level. I wouldn't expect it to last a really, really long time. But that power level is certainly well within the range. There's lots of guys running that, not just me running that, one trick pony kind of thing. We've run hundreds of runs that are 1,000 horsepower or more, so we know that it will do that easily. Would you trust an MLS 1100 on a blower and a 400? Oh, so you're running 1100 with a blower and a 400 shot? Okay, no, that's you're more in the range of needing other things than. And on that note, it is time to go. Thank you guys all for showing up. I will be back tonight.